All right. Real quick, I want to give some quick learning lessons that I had from messing around with my side projects on agents. So I've used Cursor for almost everything. Uh, Anecdotally, I have found Cursor's agent drastically superior to every other agent, and I say this in the sense that I switch between these days VS Code and Cursor quite regularly. Windsurf's been super underwhelming and buggy, generally speaking. So contextually, Cursor's fine, very powerful, but um, one of the things I was doing was migrating my side project from Next.js to TanStack. And let's see, Next.js to TanStack migration. When I started this, like the way you do these things and make the sort of the agents, if you will, more powerful is context. Everything's context, which is like give it lots of data about what you wanted to do, make that data specific, make it actionable. So when I was doing this, I googled this. I'm like, oh great, they actually have a guide to do it. I'm like, this is cool. And then what I did is I immediately stuck this in here, and I'm like, help me write a migration guide from Next.js to TanStack. This, I don't know what this is going to do in the docs repo, but I did this in my other repo, and what it did, because Agent is pretty smart, it took my repository, built one catered to my repository, took these docs, pulled them in, and actually wrote up like effectively a markdown file. You then can take that markdown file, feed it back in. You can also refine it, and I'll show you. This will probably finish in a minute, but basically you build this sort of these rules, if you will. It doesn't matter what you want to call it, but it's a context file. You can kind of think of it as like a set of instructions and guidelines and constraints. And then honestly, it works extraordinarily well for completing tasks once you do that. Now, there are some caveats there. So first, this is just one way to build this. You can build it by hand, but one thing I have come to learn is the best thing you can do around this is really focusing on code samples and stuff. And so you'll see this. This is in our docs repo. I generated this yesterday. I've not even reviewed this, to be honest. I knew it was like somewhat reasonable when I quickly skimmed, but it generated this by just analyzing our repository. And the idea is that will like bootstrap you. And then when you want to generate code or do something, reference this file and then have it do the work. And it's going to pull in all of this content into your prompt effectively, and just be much more reliable. And so what you generally want to do is like, you can see things like platform specific content. Oh, it needs to pull in these includes. This is great because this is what you want to do, but also this is not enough for it to truly grok how it's supposed to use these and when it's supposed to use these. So you want to remove the guesswork, and you really want to give it a lot of examples. So I don't know. We'll see what it's doing over here right now. Interesting. It stuck it in our docs. So not quite what you'd normally want, but it's because it's a docs repo. But you'll find here it's like, this is not at all what we wanted. So ignore this for the sake of this argument, but you get the context of how to do that. But like generally what you want to do is fill it with things like code blocks. And so for example, say you had one of these rule files, these scripts, whatever, and you really were focused on how to write tests in the context of our code base. So maybe you use snapshots, maybe you have these functions to test errors in a specific way. Like there's all these little like behaviors that you've designed for your application. You would build a file, call it tests.mdc. So these are cursor rule files, so you'll see it up here. If you can actually, assuming the resolution is not too low, but it doesn't matter. And you can kind of ignore the agent requested, etc. You can just do manual, to be honest, because what you want to do is you're generally like at contribution guidelines. Like you want to reference them in here, just to make sure it's picking the right context versus relying on magic. Don't rely on magic. But then you would have like this test document that's just filled with examples of how you would write a test correctly, like the boilerplate you'd use, the patterns you would use. And then you can go from there and be like, hey, I need tests for XYZ, and then maybe it's like the file that the tests are in. You can also pass in another example, like look at file.test, like a test example for, some behaviors. Anyways, the very long-winded version of that just boils down to like give it the right things to reference, and it will like run beautifully from code generation. So the Next.js thing is complicated. It's a complex framework. It has too many implicit behaviors that it's really hard to reason about for humans and machines. But for example, I did this with TRPC, migrating it to ORPC. 99% of it did itself. It doesn't mean it was like the most efficient or the fastest, but it did it while I was doing other things. And I had to check in once in a while and click continue. And I still probably spent 4 hours massaging the rules file that I built, because like you would run it, you'd see some mistakes, you would help guide it, you would go update the rules to like take into account those mistakes so it got it right next time, and then you kind of continue from there. Works unbelievably well for that. So that's one sort of context file, super, super important. Context in general, super important. The second thing to be aware of, this is very expensive. So depending on the size of the task and how much you're asking it to codegen and how long it's going to run, it's going to cost a lot of money. So max mode is this in Cursor. This is basically like give me lots of like context tokens and stuff. Use Claude 4 all the time. Don't even bother with the others. In all honesty, O3 is not that good. Gemini 2.5 is fine, but it's not as good. Right now, maybe that'll change. But Claude 4, very good. Use max mode when you need a really complex task that needs a lot of context. But just know, I burned through $200 in a day doing this on my personal project. And then $50, I think, a week later doing it with this Next.js migration thing. And so it adds up really fast, but you kind of need some of this. And like go for that, like you'll be like genuinely impressed by this, and it really unlocks the capabilities of agents. So when you're thinking about this, like start thinking about how we contribute these like scripts, if you will, like scripts as in like a playwright or something. Like this is like the way you would teach somebody to do something. Start building those into our repositories, whether it's Cursor rules specifically or just like a folder filled with almost like these runbooks. And so that's like another sort of prior art mechanism you can rely on here. Like just runbooks like write a new test or build a new API endpoint and things like that. And it works very, very well. And then the one last thing I will say on this, because we don't have a lot of this in Sentry yet, but on PDID, you can actually see some of this. So if you go to my Cursor rules over here, this ORPC route, almost flawless. It will code gen almost everything for me in my application at this point. Now, it doesn't nail everything, and most of this is CRUD behavior, so it's simple. But a lot of what we do is CRUD behavior. And so you can kind of look at this for an example, but it's got a lot going on in here. It's got examples of how to do this. Then it's got behaviors like do it in this order and like various, sometimes just like subjective taste, right? That I wanted it to behave in a certain way. And I generated this file, and I generated it, and more importantly, I didn't generate it in Cursor. So I'm showing Cursor here, but like you got to think a little bit beyond that scope. So what I did originally was I took something, I think I took a big example of a route I had made that I had like handcrafted, and I tried to make it as correct as possible, and it had just enough complexity. And then I brought that into ChatGPT, and specifically you want to use O3 in ChatGPT. It's by far the most powerful for this. I brought it in there because you're able to massage things a lot better. It's more generalized. And I had it help define me the rules. And generally you end up sitting there and be like, be more concise, lose flavor text. You're like, you kind of need to tell it to be a little bit better at its job, frankly. But then I ended up with something like this. And this is fundamentally the one file that I use to migrate TRPC to ORPC. And again, almost automatically. I've got another one. This is sort of my Next.js thing, which not quite as good. There's a lot more complexity. Again, more complexity, more difficult. But anyways, there are a bunch of examples of these. Everybody's still learning, but context is the name of the game. Hopefully this is helpful.